The heat was a physical thing, a weight that pressed down on the cracked earth of Juniper Flats and bled the color from the sky. It baked the splintered rails of the corral and shimmered above the iron-hard ruts of the trail leading to the Lost Comet Ranch. The late afternoon sun, a merciless sovereign, held the land in its thrall, silencing all but the most stubborn sounds: the dry rustle of wind through the cattails lining Painted Gull Wash, and the rhythmic, metallic complaint of a windmill turning in a breeze that offered no relief. It was a wind that carried more dust than coolness, a constant, gritty whisper across a landscape that had long ago surrendered to thirst. From this shimmering haze of heat and dust, she appeared, a phantom coalescing into flesh and bone at the ranch's gate. Elara Finch did not walk so much as she was propelled by the last dregs of a desperate will. Her dress, once a respectable calico, was a tapestry of tears and grime, one sleeve hanging by a thread. Dust clung to the damp tracks of sweat on her face, caking in the fine lines of exhaustion around her eyes and mouth. She stumbled, a lurching, uneven gait that spoke of miles traveled over unforgiving terrain, and when she caught herself on the gatepost, her hand was raw, her wrist circled by the angry red indentation of a rope. She clung to the rough wood, her knuckles white, each breath a ragged, painful tear in the silence. Her world had shrunk to the burning in her lungs and the frantic, hammering drumbeat of her heart against her ribs. High above, perched on the windmill's platform, Colton Hale worked with the quiet, focused economy of movement that defined his existence. He was a man shaped by the solitude and severity of the land itself, lean, weathered, with hands calloused from labor and a gaze accustomed to scanning vast, empty horizons. He was replacing a worn bearing, the screech of metal on metal having grated on his nerves for a week. He had the new piece greased and ready, his concentration narrowed to the task, when a flicker of movement at the edge of his vision broke the spell. It was a disturbance in the otherwise static landscape, a wrongness that drew his eye. He looked down and froze. For a long moment, he saw only a shape, a woman where no woman should be. Then his focus sharpened, and the details came into brutal relief: the tattered dress, the wild disarray of her sun-scorched hair, the way she leaned against the gate, as if it were the only thing holding her upright. He saw the tremor that racked her thin frame, but it was her eyes that held him. As she lifted her head, her gaze swept the ranch yard with a hunted, animal panic before locking onto his. He had seen that look before in mustangs trapped in a box canyon, a terrifying blend of raw fear and unbroken defiance. It was a plea for help that simultaneously dared him to refuse. He moved without conscious thought, descending the ladder with a sureness that belied the sudden tension coiling in his gut. He didn't make a sound, his worn boots landing softly in the dust. He stopped a dozen feet from the gate, not wanting to spook her further. He could see her more clearly now, the caked mud on her bare feet, the dark, ugly bruise blooming on her cheekbone. She was young, younger than he'd first thought, but her eyes held a weariness that had nothing to do with years. Elara watched him approach, every muscle in her body screaming to run, to flee back into the desolate wilderness that had nearly broken her, but there was nowhere left to run. This was it, the end of the line. She had seen the ranch name burned into the archway a mile back Lost Comet, and the bitter irony had fueled her last. Stumbling steps. Sheeta, too, was a lost thing, fallen from her sky. The man was tall, his shadow stretching long in the dying light. He moved with a quiet purpose that was unnerving. He wasn't rushing, wasn't shouting. He was just watching, assessing. Her throat was a desert, her tongue a leaden weight. She forced the words past lips that were cracked and bleeding. The sound that emerged was a harsh, desperate croak, barely audible above the wind. "Get inside first." The effort cost her. A wave of dizziness washed over her, and she tightened her grip on the gatepost, spots dancing in her vision. She took a gasping breath, her eyes darting back towards the trail she had followed, a path of pale dust snaking through the sagebrush. The emptiness back there was somehow more terrifying than a visible threat. It was a void that could, at any moment, be filled. Colton heard the rasping plea, but it was the frantic backward glance that spurred him to action. This was not a drifter looking for a meal. This was a person running from something that was still coming. He closed the distance between them, his face an unreadable mask. He didn't ask her name, didn't ask what had happened. The questions were a luxury they didn't have. He shrugged off the heavy canvas duster he wore, the fabric stiff with dust, and the faint scent of leather and sweat. He draped it over her shoulders. The coat was huge on her, swallowing her small frame, but it was a shield, a barrier against the prying eyes of the empty landscape. The weight of it was strangely grounding. Without a word, he turned to the house, his hand, broad and calloused, lifted the iron latch on the small gate. The creak it made was deafening in the charged silence. He pushed it open and gestured for her to pass. Alara hesitated for a fraction of a second, a final, primal flicker of distrust. This man was a stranger. The house was a trap as much as it was a sanctuary. But the terror at her back was a far more immediate and monstrous thing than the unknown in front of her. She pushed herself off the post and staggered through the gate. He led her across the packed earth yard, past a silent water pump and a trough where a single horse lifted its head to watch them pass. The ranch house was built of dark, heavy timber, its windows small and deep-set, like the cautious eyes of a predator. Colton opened the thick wooden door and guided her into the kitchen. The air inside was cool and dim, heavy with the scent of wood smoke, old coffee, and curing herbs that hung in dry bunches from the rafters. It was a space of stark, masculine utility. Iron pots hung from hooks, a large wooden table dominated the center of the room, and a formidable cast iron stove radiated a gentle warmth. On it, a kettle sent a thin, hissing plume of steam into the air, the sound a soft counterpoint to Alara's ragged breathing. The sudden coolness made her shiver violently, an uncontrollable tremor that started deep in her bones. Colton's duster did little to stop it. It was the shudder of a body that had been running on pure adrenaline and was now on the verge of collapse. Yet, even as her teeth chattered, she forced her spine to straighten. She would not fall apart in front of this stranger. She had not survived the last 2 days, only to be reduced to a weeping, helpless mess. She wrapped her arms around herself, her gaze fixed on the floorboards, refusing to meet his eyes, refusing to accept the pity she was sure she would see there. Colton saw the shiver and the proud, rigid set of her jaw. He moved to the stove, his actions deliberate. He took a heavy ceramic basin from a shelf and poured steaming water from the kettle into it, followed by cool water from a bucket by the door until the temperature was right. He set the basin on the edge of the big wooden table. Beside it, he placed a clean, folded piece of linen cloth and a small, rough bar of lye soap. "For your hands," he said, his voice low and even, devoid of any inflection that might suggest pity or judgment. Then he did something that stunned her more than any question would have. He turned his back on her. He walked to the far side of the room, to a window that looked out over the corrals, and stood there, giving her the illusion of privacy. He was giving her back a piece of her dignity, a courtesy so profound and unexpected it almost broke the dam of her control. Tears pricked at the back of her eyes, hot and sharp, but she blinked them away fiercely. She would not cry. She moved to the table, her legs unsteady. She dipped the cloth into the warm water and began to wash the grime from her hands and face. The water turned gray instantly. She scrubbed at her wrists, the motion gentle over the raw, chafed skin where the rope had been. The sting was a dull, distant pain compared to the fear that still clawed at her insides. She washed away the dust and the dried sweat, the salt of tears she hadn't even realized she'd shed. With each stroke of the cloth, she felt like she was erasing a small piece of the nightmare, reclaiming the skin beneath. Suddenly, a sound cut through the quiet air, the distant, unmistakable thunder of hoofbeats. Alara went rigid. The cloth fell from her numb fingers, splashing into the basin. Her head snapped up, her eyes wide with terror, fixed on the door. Her heart, which had just begun to slow, launched itself into a frantic, suffocating rhythm. They had found her. After everything, they had found her. The breath she had been holding lodged in her throat, a knot of pure panic. Colton turned from the window, his expression hardening. He had heard it too. His hand moved instinctively towards the rifle that rested on a pair of deer antlers above the mantelpiece. The sound grew louder, a chaotic drumming. Closer now, just beyond the walls of the house. Elara squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the inevitable, the splintering of the door, the triumphant, cruel laughter, the feel of Burke Malloy's heavy hand in her hair. But the crash never came. Instead, the hoofbeats were accompanied by a loud, bovine snort and the solid thud of something heavy hitting the outer fence. The sound receded, moving away towards the pasture. Colton relaxed his stance, a slow breath easing from his lungs. "Cattle," he said, his voice still low. "Got spooked by a coyote, most likely bumping the fence line." The relief that flooded Elara was so immense it left her weak. Her legs gave way, and she sank onto the bench by the table, her body trembling anew, this time with the aftershocks of terror. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking. The sounds she made were not of weeping, but of someone fighting desperately for air. Colton let the silence stretch, giving her time to regain her composure. He moved back to the stove and poured 2 cups of coffee, the aroma dark and strong. He placed one on the table in front of her. He didn't speak until her breathing had evened out. "Who are you running from?" he finally asked. The question was direct, quiet, but it held the force of a demand. Elara lifted her head. Her face was pale, her eyes haunted. She took a shuddering breath, the story she had held captive now clawing its way out. "Burke Malloy," she whispered, the name itself a foul taste in her mouth. She saw a flicker of recognition in the man's eyes. Malloy's reputation as a collector of debts and of people was a dark shadow that stretched across the territory. "My stepfather, Silas Rook. He owns the saloon at Copper Butte. He played cards with Malloy." She stared down at her raw wrists, the story tumbling out in broken pieces. Silas lost. He lost everything. The saloon, the stock, all of it. And when there was nothing left to wager, Her voice broke. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to continue. "He signed a paper, a marker. Malloy's man held a gun on me while he signed it. Silas used me to cover his debt. Malloy, he came to collect what he was owed." She didn't need to explain the rest. The torn dress, the bruised face, the rope burns, they told the tale of her collection and her escape. She had been property, a chit to be cashed, and she had run. Colton listened, his face impassive, but a cold fury was kindling in the depths of his dark eyes. He had seen the corruption that followed men like Malloy, and the weakness that defined men like Silas Rook. He had seen it fester in the boomtowns and poison the good land. But to see it standing here, shivering in his kitchen, in the form of this terrified, defiant young woman, was to see it in a new and terrible light. He looked from her haunted face to the darkening world outside his window. The wind picked up, pushing against the heavy kitchen door, making it groan on its iron hinges. The sound was slow, rhythmic, ominous. "Kiri, Kiri, Kiri," like the slow, deliberate ticking of a countdown clock. He looked back at her, his gaze steady and unwavering. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet, but it was as hard and unyielding as the land he worked. "You came through the right gate." Dawn did not break at the Lost Comet Ranch. It crept. It arrived as a cold, gray dilution of the blackness, a slow separation of sky from earth. The chill of the high desert night seeped through the thick timber walls of the small house, carrying with it the scent of juniper and cold ash. Elara had not slept, not truly. She had drifted on a shallow, feverish tide of exhaustion, starting awake at every creak of the house settling, every distant coyote's cry. She had been given a simple cot near the hearth, where the embers of the night's fire still pulsed with a dull red life. Colton Hale had taken a blanket and disappeared onto the porch, a silent act of guardianship that left her both rattled and, for the first time in memory, strangely protected. She was stiff. Every muscle ached from the desperate, stumbling run that had brought her here. Her wrists were a fiery torment, the rope burns raw and weeping. She sat up, pushing aside the coarse wool blanket, and the reality of her situation returned with a suffocating weight. She was trapped not by Malloy, not yet, but by circumstance, a fugitive in a stranger's house. The main room was still in deep shadow, but she could make out Colton's shape by the window. He was already dressed, standing perfectly still, a mug of coffee steaming in his hand as he watched the eastern horizon. He seemed carved from the same unyielding landscape he surveyed, a man who existed in a state of permanent, quiet vigilance. He must have heard her stir, but he did not turn. On the heavy wooden table, where she had scrubbed the grime from her hands hours before, sat a small, neatly folded pile of clothing. It was not a dress. It was a man's muslin shirt, faded from sun and lye soap, but scrupulously clean. Beside it lay a pair of canvas trousers, worn at the knees but patched with careful stitching, and on the floor, beneath the table, sat a pair of old work boots. They were scarred and cracked, but the leather was dark and supple, and she could smell the faint, waxy scent of fresh polish. He had polished them. The realization struck her with an odd force. It was an act of profound and practical respect. He was not offering charity. He was offering utility. He was giving her tools, not a costume. "There's a screen in the corner," he said, his voice still low, directed at the window pane. "Coffee's hot. The water in the basin is fresh." Elara murmured a thanks to his back, her throat tight. She took the clothes, their rough texture a comfort against her raw nerves. Behind the rickety three-panel screen, she peeled off the tattered, filthy calico dress. The garment was a record of her humiliation, stained with trail dust, torn by branches, and carrying the faint, sour smell of the saloon and Burke Malloy's whiskey-soaked grip. She let it fall to the floor in a heap, a shed skin she wanted to burn. She pulled the muslin shirt over her head. It was large, the shoulders drooping past her own, the sleeves hanging over her hands. It smelled of sun-dried cotton and wood smoke, a clean, impersonal scent that felt like a baptism. The canvas trousers were stiff, held up only by a length of rope he'd provided as a makeshift belt. Finally, she slid her feet into the boots. They were heavy, but they were solid. They were armor. When she stepped out from behind the screen, she was no longer the tattered woman who had collapsed at his gate. She was something else, someone undefined, but she was no longer property. She was a person disguised as a ranch hand, and in that, there was a strange and desperate power. She had reclaimed a small, vital piece of the self that Silas Rook and Burke Malloy had tried to tear away. Colton turned then, his gaze sweeping over her. It was an appraising look, not personal, but practical. He nodded once, a curt gesture of approval. "The north fence is down, a section of it. The cattle I heard last night." He didn't ask if she was coming. He grabbed his heavy gloves and headed for the door, and Elara, after a moment's hesitation, grabbed the canvas duster he'd given her and followed him out into the biting morning air. The sun was just beginning to crest the mesas, painting the edges of the clouds in shades of bloody orange and gold. The wind was relentless, a cold razor that cut through the canvas and muslin, making her shiver. Colton moved with a long, ground-eating stride, carrying a heavy post-hole digger, a spool of wire, and a leather satchel of tools. Elara nearly had to run to keep up, her new boots awkward on the uneven, rocky ground. They reached the north line after a 20-minute walk. A half-dozen heavy cedar posts had been knocked flat, the wire snarled in a dangerous tangle. It was the work of the spooked cattle, a breach in his fortress. Colton didn't curse or sigh. He simply dropped his tools and began to work. He reset the first post, tamping the earth around it with a rhythmic, pounding grace. The sound was the only thing that broke the howl of the wind. Elara stood uselessly, her hands jammed deep in the pockets of the duster. She hated this feeling, the familiar uselessness of being a woman in a saloon, an ornament, a thing to be looked at or wagered. "Hold this," Colton said. He wasn't looking at her. He was pulling the tangled wire, needing to create tension. Elara rushed forward, grabbing the heavy wire with both hands. It was cold. The barbs sharp even through her gloves. He had left a pair for her on the porch. She pulled, leaning back with all her slight weight, the wire cutting into her palms. He worked on the next post, setting it deep. He began to splice a new section of wire, his gloved fingers moving with a speed and precision that was mesmerizing. He was fashioning a knot, a complex loop of wire and twine. "What is that?" she asked, her voice thin in the wind. "Clove hitch," he said. He pointed to the twine. "Need another one. 3 feet down." He handed her a length of rough, tarred twine. Elara pulled off the gloves, knowing she couldn't manage it with them on. Her fingers, still stiff and sore, fumbled with the twine. The rope burns on her wrists screamed in protest as the coarse fibers bit into her raw skin. She tried to mimic the knot he'd made, looping the twine over the wire, but it was a clumsy, pathetic mess. "No," he said, his voice flat. He reached over, his hand, broad and scarred, covered hers. He didn't just do it for her, he guided her fingers, forcing them to make the pattern. Around, cross, under, pull, the twine bit into her skin, and she saw a bead of fresh blood well up on her knuckle, but the knot held. It was tight, ugly, but it held. "Again," he commanded. She did it again, and again. Her hands were shaking from the cold and the pain, but a fierce, stubborn pride was rising in her. She was not useless. She could learn this. She could tie this knot. She was binding the fence, but she was also binding the frayed, broken edges of herself. As she knelt to brace a post, she leaned forward, and something heavy slipped from the pocket of the trousers he had given her. It fell to the dirt with a dull, metallic clink. She had salvaged only 2 things from her ruined dress, before discarding it a small wooden pin her mother had carved. And this? It was a coin, or rather, a token, larger than a silver dollar, made of cheap, heavy brass. It was caked in mud. She picked it up, rubbing the grit away with her thumb. The emblem stamped into it was stark a single, oversized ace of diamonds. She heard Colton stop his work. The sudden silence was deafening, broken only by the wind. She didn't have to look up to know he was watching her. "He gave me this," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Burke, he pressed it into my hand. After Silas signed the paper, he said, 'That's what you are, my lucky ace, my property.'" Colton's shadow fell over her. He hunkered down, his eyes fixed on the token. "It's his crew's mark," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Any man carrying one of those drinks for free at the Copper Butte, it's his brand. Means he owns the man, or he owns what he wants." The token felt suddenly scalding in her hand. She wanted to throw it, to hurl it as far as she could into the sagebrush, but she couldn't. It was evidence. It was the proof of her shame. The unspoken tension between them was now a tangible thing, humming like the fence wire they had just tightened. The revelation of the token had broken a seal. As they worked their way down the line, the story continued to spill from her, piece by broken piece, the wind snatching the words from her mouth. "It was at the Copper Butte," she said, her voice stronger now, fueled by a cold anger. "Silas played for 2 straight days. He lost the saloon first, then the house, then he put me on the table. He signed a bill of sale, not a simple marker. He laughed about it. He said I was worth more than the whole damn town. He used the saloon's official seal, the one he kept in his desk for deeds and contracts. He stamped it right on the paper." Colton stopped tamping a post. "A seal, a bill of sale." "Yes, like I was a shipment of goods." Colton's jaw tightened. He turned his gaze from the fence line to the vast, empty horizon, as if searching for something. He was processing the information. This was no longer just a barroom wager. It was a perversion of the law, a bill of sale, even one signed under duress, carried a dangerous weight in this territory. A seal made it look official. They worked the rest of the morning in a strained, charged silence. When the last post was set and the wire was taut, they walked back, the sun now high and hot at their backs. The temporary safety of the ranch felt thinner, the horizon more menacing. Back in the kitchen, Colton didn't rest. He went to a small, cluttered desk in the corner, a place Alara hadn't noticed before. He pulled out a heavy, leather-bound book. She expected it to be a Bible, or perhaps a book of poetry. It was neither. The words, "Livestock Ledger," were embossed on the cover. He opened it, the pages whispering. It was filled with his neat, precise script. It was a record of his life. Born 14 calves. April, lost 1 steer. Coyote, April, sold 20 head. May, but it was more than that. He flipped to the back, to a section titled Sundries. Here, his meticulous nature was laid bare. June 4th. Stranger at the general store. Asking about water rights. Wore a red kerchief. June 20th. 2 riders by the north well. Did not answer hail. Rode painted horses. July 10th. Found tracks by the creek. Shod horse. 1 shoe new. Man was watching the house. July 22nd. Man in Juniper Flats asking if I was looking to hire. Had an ace of diamonds token on his hat. Colton underlined that last entry with a decisive, dark stroke of his pencil. He was cross-referencing her story with his own observations. He had been watched. Malloy hadn't just appeared. He had been sniffing around the edges of the lost comet for weeks, assessing its defenses, assessing him. Perhaps Silas Rook hadn't just lost Alara in a game. Perhaps he had been targeted, his weakness exploited to give Malloy a reason to come here. Alara watched him, a strange, cold calm settling over her. This was not a man who panicked. He did not bluster or make false promises. He gathered facts. He recorded details. He prepared. He was treating Burke Malloy not as a bogeyman, but as a problem, like a downed fence or a harsh winter. They settled into a new rhythm, a silent convention born of shared danger and mutual respect for boundaries. He didn't ask her about her escape, about the 2 days she spent hiding in gullies and washes, her feet bleeding, her heart in her throat. He didn't ask what Malloy had done or tried to do, and she, in turn, did not ask about the deep, ropey scar that ran from his left temple into his hairline, or why a man who was so meticulous and intelligent lived in such profound isolation. They asked only what was necessary for survival. Where does this go? Is the well water clean? Do you have another rifle? He did, a smaller Winchester. He checked that it was loaded and left it by the hearth, within her reach. The tension stretched, thin and humming, until midday. The heat was oppressive. Colton cooked, a simple, thick stew of beans and salt pork. They sat at the table, the same way they had the night before, the silence thick with unspoken things. Alara ate slowly, the food tasteless in her mouth. She was thinking about the bill of sale, about the word property. She put her spoon down, her hand trembling. Malloy, he told Silas. He was buying a wife. That was the word he used. Colton didn't look up, but his chewing slowed. Alara's voice dropped to a barely audible whisper. Her shame so profound, it was a physical sickness. He was wrong. Silas was wrong. She stared at her own hands, at the raw, bloody knots she had tied. I've never belonged to anyone. Not in that way. Not in any way. The admission hung in the hot, still air. It was a confession of a different kind of vulnerability. A desperate plea to be seen as something other than what Malloy and her stepfather believed her to be. Colton Hale stopped. His spoon was halfway to his mouth. The kitchen was utterly silent, save for the buzz of a fly against the window pane. Alara braced herself for pity, for disgust, for a crude question. He did none of those things. He slowly, deliberately, placed his spoon back in the tin bowl. He did not look at her. Instead, he turned his head and stared out the open doorway, past the porch, to the vast, sun-scorched emptiness of the prairie. He was giving her the same gift he had given her the night before, the dignity of not being watched. He let her words settle, refusing to let them become a spectacle. When he finally spoke, his voice was flat, a statement of fact, as unyielding as the landscape he was watching. "Here, nobody buys anybody." That was all. He turned back to his stew and picked up his spoon. The subject was closed. The knot of panic in Alara's chest eased. Just a fraction. He had heard her. He had understood. And he had dismissed the very premise of her fear. They finished the meal in their now customary silence. The unspoken had been spoken, and the air, paradoxically, felt clearer. The reprieve lasted until the sun began its long, slow descent, painting the western sky in hues of fire. Alara was on the porch, attempting to clean the mud from her boots, when Colton, who was checking the cinch on his horse by the corral, suddenly went still. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking past her, towards the main trail. Alara followed his gaze. Far out, at the very edge of the ranch's boundary line, a single rider had appeared. He was a black silhouette against the glare, too far to make out any features. He wasn't approaching the house. He wasn't hailing them. He just sat on his horse, watching. Alara's heart began a slow, heavy drumbeat. The rider dismounted. He moved to the main gatepost, the very post she had clung to when she arrived. He seemed to be doing something to the wood, a quick, deliberate action. Then, just as silently as he had appeared, he remounted, wheeled his horse around, and galloped back the way he had come, vanishing into a cloud of his own dust. A full minute passed. Neither Alara nor Colton moved. Then, wordlessly, Colton began to walk towards the gate. Alara stood, her half-cleaned boots forgotten, and followed him, her body rigid with a terrible, cold dread. He reached the gatepost. He stopped. Alara came up behind him and stifled a gasp, her hand flying to her throat. Jammed deep into the wood, quivering slightly from the force of the impact, was a long, thin-bladed dagger. The handle was wrapped in worn leather, and the blade itself was dark, not with rust, but with use. It was a knife meant for skinning or for fighting. Colton reached out and wrapped his hand around the hilt. He pulled. The blade came free with a sick, tearing sound. Shink! The wood around the hole was splintered. He didn't need to examine it for long. Burned into the side of the leather-wrapped handle, crude but unmistakable, were 2 letters. B.M. It was not a legal document. It was not a request for parley. It was a message. It was a promise. It was a declaration of war. They did not have to wait long. The sun had barely climbed past its zenith, beating down on the ranch with a white-hot intensity. When the dust appeared on the horizon, it was not the lazy plume of a lone rider or a meandering mail coach. This was a purposeful, aggressive cloud, churned up by the hooves of several horses moving at a determined, arrogant pace. Alara was on the porch, mending a tear in the canvas duster with a needle and coarse thread she'd found in a tin box. Her hands were still clumsy, the needle awkward in her unaccustomed fingers, but the simple, repetitive motion was a fragile anchor in a sea of anxiety. She felt the vibration through the soles of her borrowed boots before she heard the sound. A low, rhythmic drumming that grew steadily louder, a sound that spoke of an approaching storm. Her head snapped up, the needle poised in midair. The blood in her veins turned to ice. Colton emerged from the barn, his stride unhurried. He carried a leather bucket, which he set down by the water pump as if it were any other day, any other task, but his eyes were fixed on the approaching dust cloud, his face a mask of grim neutrality. He had known this was coming. He had been waiting. "Go inside," he said, his voice quiet but carrying the unyielding force of a command. "Stay away from the windows." For a moment, rebellion flared in Alara. She was not a child to be hidden, not a prize to be fought over and then locked away. She was the reason for this storm, but one look at the cold, hard set of his jaw, and she knew this was not about her protection in the way a man protects a fragile object. It was strategy. He needed a clear field. He needed to know she was not in the line of fire. She gave a single, curt nod, her throat too tight for words. She backed into the cool dimness of the house, leaving the heavy door slightly ajar so she could see through the crack. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. The riders slowed as they reached the gate, their horses snorting and stamping in the heat. There were 4 of them. At the lead was Burke Malloy. He sat his big dark gelding with a sloppy proprietary slouch, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. He was a thick, powerful man, his face flushed with sun and whiskey, his expensive coat and hat layered with trail dust. Beside him were 2 men of a similar cut-hard, vacant-eyed riders who looked as if they'd been born in a saddle and nursed on cheap liquor. The 4th man, younger and nervous, hung back slightly. Malloy surveyed the ranch with a contemptuous gaze, his eyes lingering on the neat woodpile, the solid construction of the barn, the quiet order of the place. It was a world entirely alien to his own. He looked towards the house, his smirk widening as if he knew Alara was watching. He reached into his coat and produced a folded piece of paper. It was creased, grimy, and stained with a dark, wet ring where a whiskey bottle had once rested. With a flick of his wrist, he sent it sailing through the air. It fluttered and landed in the dust of the yard, a pathetic, soiled flag of conquest. Hale Malloy's voice was a booming, arrogant roar that shattered the afternoon's oppressive silence. "I'm here on business. I've come for my property. Send her out." The door to the house opened fully. Colton stepped out onto the porch and stood at the top of the 3 wooden steps. Alara's breath caught. His rifle, the one that had rested above the mantelpiece, was still there. The smaller Winchester he had given her was still propped by the hearth. He stood on the porch, his hands hanging loose and empty at his sides. He was meeting 4 armed men with nothing but his own 2 hands. It was not foolishness. Alara understood it instantly. It was a statement. This is my land. You are the aggressors. I meet you not as a combatant, but as a man defending his home. It was an act of pure, unadulterated, frontier honor. So profound and so reckless it made her soul ache. Colton's gaze was flat and cold. He didn't look at the men, not directly. He looked at the piece of paper lying in the dirt. "That's a long ride to deliver trash," he said, his voice carrying easily in the still air. "The wind'll take care of it for you." Malloy's smirk faltered, replaced by a flash of irritation. "Don't play games with me, rancher. That paper says the girl is mine, bought and paid for. Silas Rook's own seal is on it. It's legal. Now send her out before I lose my patience." Colton took a slow step down, then another, until he stood on the packed earth of his yard, halfway between the porch and the gate. He was positioning himself. Alara realized, drawing them away from the house, creating a field of engagement on his own terms. "That paper is an agreement between a fool and a vulture," Colton said, his voice dangerously soft. "It's got nothing to do with me, and it's got nothing to do with her." "She's a debt," Malloy snarled, his face purpling with anger. He leaned forward in his saddle, his hand resting on the butt of the pistol holstered at his hip. "A walking, breathing debt, and I'm the collector." "A debt is money," Colton replied, his eyes finally lifting to meet Malloy's. They were as cold and gray as a winter sky. "A person is a person. You're not collecting anything here." The simple, profound morality of the statement hung in the air, an impassable wall. For a moment, no one moved. The wind whispered through the eaves of the barn, and one of the horses tossed its head, the jingle of its bridle unnaturally loud. Malloy's bravado was being eroded by this man's impossible calm. He had come expecting a fight or a frightened surrender, not a lecture on ethics. Frustration and rage boiled over. With a guttural roar, Malloy kicked his spurs into his horse's flanks. "To hell with this," he bellowed, yanking the reins to wheel the horse towards the yard. He meant to charge, to ride Colton down, to trample this quiet defiance into the dust. But he had misjudged his man. Colton did not retreat. He did not flinch. As the horse lunged forward, he moved with a speed that was utterly at odds with his previous stillness, in a single, fluid motion. He stepped, not back, but forward and to the side, inside the horse's turn. Before Malloy could react, Colton's left hand shot out and seized his right wrist, the one reaching for his gun in an iron grip. His right hand clamped down on Malloy's elbow. It was not a punch. It was a terrifying application of leverage. Colton used the horse's own momentum, twisting Malloy's arm at an unnatural angle. Malloy screamed, a high, strangled sound of pain and surprise. His fingers flew open, his grip on the reins lost. He was pulled, off balance and helpless, from the saddle. He crashed to the ground in a heavy, undignified heap, the air exploding from his lungs in a pained grunt. The horse, spooked and riderless, shied away, its eyes rolling. The entire sequence had taken less than 2 seconds. For a heartbeat, there was stunned silence. Then Malloy's men reacted. The 2 riders beside him simultaneously drew their weapons. They were not pistols, but long, wicked-looking knives. They kicked their horses forward, their faces contorted in snarls of feral loyalty. From the doorway, Alara watched in a paralysis of terror. This was it, the moment she had been dreading. Colton had taken down the leader, but he was on foot, unarmed, and now faced 2 armed men on horseback. He was going to die. He was going to die for her. And in that instant, something inside her broke. Not her spirit, but her fear. It shattered, replaced by a white-hot surge of pure, unadulterated rage. She would not stand here. She would not be the passive object of this violence. She would not watch another person be destroyed for her sake. Her eyes darted around the dim interior of the house. By the door was a small burlap sack, lumpy and heavy, rock salt, for the churn. Without a second thought, she grabbed it. It weighed perhaps 10 pounds. She ran back to the edge of the porch, her movements fueled by a desperate, primal instinct. One of the riders was closer, urging his horse into the yard, his knife held low and ready. His attention was entirely on Colton. He didn't even see her. "Hey," she screamed, her voice raw and cracking. The rider's head snapped towards her, his face a mask of surprise. It was all the opening she needed, with a strength she didn't know she possessed. She swung the heavy sack in a wide, desperate arc and let it fly. The sack spun through the air and struck the rider squarely in the face. The burlap burst on impact, and a cloud of coarse, crystalline rock salt exploded into his eyes. He screamed, a piercing, agonized shriek, dropping his knife and clawing at his face. His horse reared, terrified by its rider's sudden blindness and pain, and bolted, galloping blindly towards the open prairie. The second rider, momentarily distracted by his partner's fate, hesitated. It was a fatal mistake. Colton was already moving. He closed the distance in 2 long strides, his boot lashing out in a powerful, precise kick that caught the man's wrist. The knife flew from his grasp, spinning end over end before burying its tip in the dirt. Before the man could recover or reach for a pistol, Colton grabbed the bridle of his horse, yanking its head down and forcing the animal backwards, step by stumbling step, until it was outside the gate. "Get out!" Colton's voice was a low growl, more menacing than any shout. Just as he forced the second man back, a new sound erupted, a low, rumbling thunder that was not from the sky. The cattle in the nearby pasture, already agitated by the shouting and the bolting horse, had finally broken. They surged as one, a wave of horns and hides, pouring through the section of fence they had weakened the night before. They stampeded across the open ground directly behind the gate, a chaotic, unstoppable river of panic and flesh. A thick, choking cloud of dust billowed up, instantly obscuring everything. It was a curtain of chaos. Burke Malloy was just staggering to his feet, his face a mask of fury, his hand reaching for the pistol he'd almost drawn. Through the swirling dust, he saw Colton turn back towards him. He fumbled for his weapon, but it was too late. Colton didn't have a gun. He didn't have a knife, but his eyes fell on a long-handled hoe leaning against the corral fence. He seized it. He didn't swing it like a club. He held it like a quarterstaff, a barrier. As Malloy lunged forward, blinded by rage and the swirling dust, Colton planted the end of the handle in the ground and angled the heavy iron head forward. Malloy ran directly into it, the solid block of forged steel catching him hard in the chest. He collapsed backward, gasping for air. The fight knocked out of him completely. The dust began to settle. The last of the cattle thundered past. The scene was one of utter disarray. Malloy was on his knees, wheezing. One of his men was a disappearing speck on the horizon. The other was cautiously trying to retrieve his knife from outside the fence, and the young, nervous one had not moved an inch, his face pale with shock. Colton stood over Malloy, the hoe held loosely in his hands. He was breathing heavily, his chest rising and falling, but his stance was steady. Malloy finally found his voice, a ragged, hate-filled gasp. He pushed himself to his feet, clutching his bruised chest. He glared at Colton, his eyes promising murder. "This ain't over, Hale," he roared, his voice cracking. "You broke my wrist. You assaulted me. I'll be back tomorrow. I'll be back with the law. I'll have the marshal himself here to see that bill of sale is honored." Colton lowered the hoe, its purpose served. He looked at the blustering, defeated man with an expression of pure contempt. "Then bring the real law," Colton said, his voice cold and clear. "Not the kind you buy from the bottom of a bottle." He turned his back on Malloy, a gesture of ultimate dismissal, and walked towards the house. The remaining henchmen, seeing their leader utterly routed, scrambled to catch his horse and helped him into the saddle. Without another word, they rode away, leaving a trail of dust and humiliation in their wake. Ilara hadn't moved from the porch. Her hands were trembling, her knees weak. The empty burlap sack lay at her feet. She watched Colton walk towards her, his face grim, his movements stiff. The adrenaline was leaving her, replaced by a profound, bone-deep exhaustion and a trembling that she couldn't control. As he climbed the steps, she saw it, a small, dark tear in his muslin shirt, right beside the second button. Malloy, in his clumsy fall, must have snagged it. It was a tiny, insignificant detail in the wake of such violence, but to Ilara, it was everything. He had put himself between her and them. He had taken the violence onto his own body, into his own home. This small tear in his shirt was a wound he had suffered for her. A wave of gratitude so powerful it was painful washed over her, mingled with a cold, terrifying dread. This was only the beginning. Malloy's pride was shattered. He would be back, and he would not come with just 3 men next time. Colton walked past her into the house without a word. Ilara's gaze was drawn back to the yard, to the gatepost where Burke's dagger had been. Something was there, something white. Malloy, in a final, pathetic act of defiance before riding off, must have dismounted and placed it there. Stuck to the rough wood by the point of the henchman's fallen knife was a single playing card, the ace of diamonds. It fluttered in the hot, dry wind, a stark white promise of violence yet to come. It was no longer a claim of ownership. It was a marker for a blood debt. The violence of the confrontation left a strange and brittle silence in its wake. The dust settled. The thundering of the cattle faded, but the tension remained, a palpable hum in the hot, still air. The ace of diamonds, pinned to the gatepost by a henchman's knife, was a stark white wound against the dark wood, a promise that the peace was merely a ceasefire, not a victory. That evening, the unspoken reality of Ilara's injuries could no longer be ignored. The rope burns on her wrists, which she had tried to hide beneath the long sleeves of Colton's shirt, were inflamed and angry. She saw him glance at them as she tried to help clear the tin plates from the table, saw the slight, almost imperceptible tightening of his jaw. He didn't comment on them directly. Instead, after the last of the evening chores were done, he walked to the far side of the house where a few stubborn, spiky plants grew in the hard-packed earth. He returned with a thick, fleshy leaf, its edges serrated like a saw. He laid it on the table and, with his skinning knife, slid it open lengthwise. The inside was a pale, translucent green, slick with a cool, clear gel. "Aloe," he said, his voice low. "My mother used it for burns." He showed her how to scrape the gel out with the edge of the knife, creating a small, glistening pile on a clean plate. Then he took a pot from the hearth, added a knob of tallow, and set it over the low, glowing embers to melt. He instructed her to add the aloe gel to the warm fat, stirring it with a wooden spoon until it formed a thick, greenish, fragrant salve. The process was slow, methodical, a quiet lesson in healing. He wasn't just giving her a remedy, he was teaching her how to make it, giving her the knowledge, the agency. When the salve was cool enough to touch, he motioned for her to sit. He brought the pot to the table, along with clean strips of linen. Alara hesitated, a lifetime of flinching from unsolicited touch, making her muscles coil. He seemed to understand. He didn't reach for her. He simply set the pot down between them and began to clean his own hands, his movements deliberate, giving her time. Slowly, she extended her hands, palms up, into the lamplight. The burns were ugly, a raw, red circle on each wrist, a brand of her captivity. With a tentative finger, she scooped up a small amount of the cool, slick salve and began to apply it to her left wrist. The relief was instantaneous, a deep, soothing coolness that quenched the fire in her skin. Colton watched her for a moment, then, satisfied she could manage, he took a strip of linen and showed her how to wrap the wound not too tight, but firm enough to hold the salve in place and keep the dirt out. She mimicked his actions on her other wrist, her fingers now steady, the simple act of self-care a reclamation of her own body. That night began the new ritual of their cohabitation, the watch. Malloy's threat to return with the law was a hollow one, for now the nearest marshal was a 3-day ride away. The more immediate danger was Malloy himself, his pride wounded, his cruelty unchecked by any legal or moral restraint. He would not wait for a badge. Colton took the first watch, sitting on the porch steps in the deepening twilight, his rifle resting across his knees. The desert came alive with a new set of sounds as the heat of the day bled into the earth. The air grew sharp and cold. Alara lay on her cot inside, but sleep was a distant country. She listened to the vast, complex symphony of the night. When it was her turn, she found him awake, his eyes accustomed to the darkness. He handed her the rifle. It was heavy, alien in her hands. "You're not listening for noise," he said softly, his voice a low rumble that didn't carry past the porch. "The desert is never quiet. You're listening for a pattern. The wind is a sigh, a coyote is a cry, but a shod horse has a rhythm. 1, 2, 3, 4. Even on soft ground. You can feel it more than you can hear it. Listen with your feet." She sat on the top step, the rifle across her lap, and she listened. For the first hour, every sound was a threat. The rustle of a tumbleweed was a man crawling through the brush. The skittering of some small nocturnal creature was the clink of a spur, but gradually, under the vast, star-dusted canopy of the sky, the sounds began to sort themselves. She learned the lonely, mournful call of a screech owl. She learned the dry, papery whisper of the wind through the cattails, and she began to understand what he meant. The sounds of the wild were chaotic, arrhythmic. The sounds of man were deliberate, repetitive. She was learning the language of her own survival. The next morning, before the sun had fully risen, Colton led a horse from the corral. It was a mare, a beautiful buckskin with a gentle eye and a calm demeanor. "This is Kite," he said. "She's yours to ride, if you want." Alara stared at the animal. She had been on a horse before, but always as a passenger, always with someone else in control. The idea of commanding such a large, powerful creature herself was both terrifying and intoxicating. It was another piece of the freedom she craved. Colton didn't throw her in the saddle. He spent an hour showing her the bridle, the bit, the blanket, the saddle itself. He explained how each piece worked, why it was important. He had her lead Kite around the corral, getting used to her weight, her scent, the feel of her warm breath on the back of her neck. He was patient, his instructions simple and direct. When she was finally in the saddle, he didn't hand her the reins and step back. He kept his left hand firmly on the bridle, his right on the reins just below hers, and he began to walk, leading the horse in a slow, wide circle. He walked beside her, a steady, grounding presence. His nearness was a comfort, a silent promise that he would not let her fall. They circled the corral again and again, Alara slowly relaxing, feeling the rhythm of the horse, the shift of muscle beneath her. "She's listening to you," Colton said. "Feel that, through the reins. She's asking you what to do next." Filled with a surge of newfound confidence, Alara gently tugged the right rein, urging Kite into a slightly tighter turn. But her movement was too jerky, her balance still uncertain. Kite, startled, took a quick sidestep. It was a small, simple movement, but it was enough. Alara, unprepared, lost her seat and tumbled sideways, landing in a soft, ignominious heap in the corral's thick dust. The fall didn't hurt. The dust was deep and fine, cushioning her landing. For a moment, she lay there, stunned, the world silent save for the soft snort of the mare. She was covered head to foot in a fine, pale powder. It was in her hair, on her face, down the front of her shirt. She must have looked utterly ridiculous. And then, a sound bubbled up from deep inside her, a sound she had not heard in what felt like a lifetime. It was a laugh, not a giggle, not a nervous titter, but a genuine, full-throated laugh of pure, unadulterated absurdity. It was the laugh of a person who had faced death and humiliation and was now brought down by a simple, clumsy fall in the dirt. The tension, the fear, the shame that had been her constant companions for days, suddenly broke. The laughter poured out of her, helpless and healing, echoing in the quiet morning air. Colton, who had rushed forward, stopped dead. He stared down at her, at this woman covered in dust, her eyes bright with unshed, laughing tears. It was the first time he had seen her smile. It transformed her face, chasing away the shadows, revealing a glimpse of the person she might have been before Silas Rook and Burke Malloy had tried to extinguish her light. A slow, almost imperceptible smile touched the corner of his own mouth. He reached down and offered her a hand. She took it, and he pulled her to her feet, a silent acknowledgement passing between them that something important had just shifted. The days that followed fell into a new, quiet rhythm, a partnership forged not in words, but in shared labor. The sheep pen on the far side of the barn, damaged in a winter storm, needed rebuilding. It became their project. The work was hard, physical, and deeply satisfying. Colton showed her how to use a handsaw, how to measure a length of timber, how to drive a nail straight and true. They worked under the hot sun, the air thick with the clean, sharp scent of freshly cut pine. Sweat stung Alara's eyes and slicked her hair, but it was a clean sweat, the sweat of honest effort. It washed away the memory of the cold sweat of fear. They developed a non-verbal language, a nod from him, and she would pass him the hammer, a gesture from her, and he would hold a post steady while she secured it. They were a team, moving in a comfortable, efficient harmony. They were not talking about the past or the uncertain future. They were building something. They were taking something broken and making it whole again. The evenings took on a new intimacy. They would eat their simple meal of beans or stew at the big wooden table, facing each other in the warm, flickering glow of the oil lamp. The small, circular pool of light created a sanctuary in the vast, dark house, shrinking their world down to just the two of them. The light caught the stray strands of her hair, turning them into a soft, golden halo. It softened the hard lines of his face, revealing a weariness in his eyes that he kept hidden during the day. They talked little, but the silence was no longer strained. It was comfortable, companionable. One evening, as they sat in that quiet circle of light, Alara found herself looking at his hands. They were resting on the table, calloused and scarred, the hands of a man who worked the land. Her gaze fell on the old, ropey scar that ran from his temple into his hairline. A scar she had noticed before but had never dared to ask about. She saw a similar, smaller scar on the back of his left hand, a pale, jagged line across the knuckles. Driven by an impulse she didn't fully understand, a need to connect, to acknowledge that he, too, was a survivor of some past violence. She slowly reached out her hand across the table. She meant only to trace the line of the scar with her fingertip, a simple, questioning touch. He saw the movement. His entire body went rigid. As her fingers came close, he flinched, pulling his hand back a sharp half-inch, a reflexive, defensive motion that was as eloquent as a shout. The air between them crackled with sudden tension. Elara froze, her hand hovering in the air, her face burning with shame. She had crossed a line. She had trespassed. She began to pull her hand back, a mumbled apology on her lips. But then, he stopped her, not with a word, but with a slight, almost imperceptible movement. He stopped pulling away. He held his hand perfectly still, the muscles in his forearm corded with tension. And then, slowly, deliberately, he moved his hand forward that half-inch, back into the path of her touch. It was an invitation. It was permission. Her breath caught in her throat. Her fingers, trembling slightly, completed their journey and gently touched the raised, pale line of the scar. It was old, long-healed. She traced its length, a silent acknowledgement of a pain she would never know, but which she could, in this small way, recognize. He did not move. He let her touch him, a profound act of trust from a man who had clearly built a fortress around himself. She finally drew her hand back, her heart pounding. She looked up and met his eyes. They were dark, unreadable, but the defensive wall was gone, just for a moment. "Get inside first," she whispered, her own voice husky, her words a direct echo of her first, desperate plea at his gate. She looked around the warm, lamplit kitchen, at the solid timber walls, at the steady, quiet man sitting across from her. That day, it was the first time in a very long time that I felt safe. The confession hung in the air, fragile and sacred. Colton held her gaze for a long moment. He gave a single, slow nod, accepting her words, acknowledging the weight of them. Then he broke the intensity of the moment, giving her an escape, a chance to breathe. He reached for the tin teapot and poured more of the hot, bitter tea into her cup. He changed the subject, his voice even and calm. "There's thunder in the mountains," he said, gesturing with his head toward the window. "We'll have rain before the week is out." She looked out the dark window. She couldn't see anything, but she could feel it, a change in the air, a distant, low rumble that was not the sound of horses. A storm was coming, both outside and in. But here, within these four walls, a new kind of peace had begun to form, fragile but real. Later that night, as Elara prepared to lie down on her cot, she saw Colton doing something at the front door. He was holding a small, brass bell, the kind that might hang on a shop door. He tied it with a piece of leather cord to the inside door latch. It gave a soft, clear chime as he tested it. He saw her watching him, a questioning look on her face. "It's not to keep you in," he said, his voice low, understanding her unspoken fear. "It's to keep the rest of the world out, or at least, to let you know it's coming." She understood then. The bell was not for him. It was for her. It was a promise that no one would ever sneak up on her again. No one would ever put their hands on her by surprise. Any entrance, any movement, would be announced by that small, clear chime. It was not a lock. It was an alarm. It was the most profound and understanding gift she had ever received. She lay down on her cot, listening to the distant, rolling thunder, and the even sound of Colton's breathing from the porch, and for the first time, she felt the promise of a real, dreamless sleep. The fragile peace of their shared labor was shattered by the arrival of the mail rider, a wiry, dust-caked man named Jebediah, who passed through the territory once every 2 weeks. He brought with him a thin bundle of letters, a month-old newspaper from the East, and more importantly, news. As Colton traded a pouch of coffee for a letter in the paper, Jebediah spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust and offered the latest gossip from Dry Cedar County. "Whole damn county's buzzing," he said, his voice a gravelly rasp. "Marshall's on his way. Abram Pike. They say he's a hard one. Straight as an arrow and just as sharp. Word is, he's not here for rustlers or claim jumpers. He's coming to look into these arrangements." He lowered his voice conspiratorially. "These debt marriages. Seems some fellas have been getting mighty creative with their poker debts. Pike's got a list, and he's coming to ask questions." Elara, who had been standing by the porch, felt the words like a physical blow. A marshal, a real lawman, not some local sheriff in the pocket of men like Malloy, but a federal marshal, a sliver of hope, so sharp and terrifying it was almost painful, pierced through the dull armor of her dread. But it was followed by a wave of cold sickness. Burke had threatened to bring the law. What if this was his law? What if Marshal Pike was coming to enforce the bill of sale? She must have made some small sound, because Colton's head turned slightly, his eyes finding hers for a brief, unreadable moment before he turned back to the mail rider. He folded the newspaper without looking at it and tucked it under his arm. "Good to know," Colton said, his voice betraying nothing. "Safe travels, Jebediah?" He waited until the rider was a small, dusty speck on the horizon before he turned and walked back to the house. Elara followed him, her mind racing. The news had changed everything. It had brought the deadline for their uncertain future crashing into the present. That evening, the quiet companionship of their meal was gone, replaced by a tense, crackling silence. The possibility of the law's arrival had given her hope, but it had also forced her to confront the full, ugly truth of what had been done to her, a truth she had kept locked away, even from Colton. "He didn't just sign a bill of sale," she said suddenly, her voice low and strained. The words seemed to hang in the lamplit air between them. Colton stopped eating, his gaze lifting to meet hers. He waited. "It was worse than that," she whispered, her eyes fixed on the flickering flame of the lamp. "He called it a wedding." The memory rose up, vivid and suffocating. It was in the grain shed behind the saloon. It smelled of rat poison and stale beer. It wasn't just Malloy and Silas. 2 of his men were there. They were the witnesses. There was no preacher. The man they called Padre was just one of the card dealers from the saloon. He held a bottle of whiskey, not a Bible. Her voice began to tremble, but she forced herself to continue. The words spilling out in a torrent. Malloy had the paper ready. It had all this legal language on it. In consideration of debts owed. In holy matrimony, they lit a lantern and hung it from a hook. It made these long, dancing shadows. One of the men had his pistol out, not pointing it at me, just holding it, letting me see it. Silas was drunk. He was laughing. He dipped a pen in the ink and told me to sign. He said it was just a formality, a way to make everything clean and proper. She looked at her own hand, remembering the feel of the pen being forced into it, Malloy's thick, sausage-like fingers closing over hers, guiding her signature onto the paper. I refused. I threw the pen down. And Malloy, he nodded to the man with the gun. The man cocked the hammer. The sound. It was so loud in that little shed. So I signed. My hand was shaking so badly. You could barely read it. And then the dealer. The fake priest? He splashed whiskey on the paper from his bottle and said, "I now pronounce you debt and collector." And they all laughed. She finally looked at Colton, her eyes swimming with a shame so profound it felt like it was drowning her. He has a signed paper. Colton. A paper that says we were married. With witnesses. That's the law he's going to bring. Colton listened to the entire story without moving, his face carved from stone. The muscle in his jaw worked, the only sign of the cold fury building inside him. When she finished, he didn't offer empty reassurances. He offered a plan. "The law has rules," he said, his voice a low, steady anchor in her sea of panic. "Even out here, a marriage needs a license. It needs to be recorded. A real preacher has to sign a register. If their story is a lie, we just need to prove it." The next morning, They rode out at dawn. He rode his steady gelding, and Alara rode Kite, the reins feeling less alien in her hands now. They weren't heading for the corrupt boomtown of Copper Butte, but for Perdition Gate, the dusty, struggling settlement that served as the official county seat. It was a 3-hour ride, and they spoke little, the urgency of their mission a silent, driving force. Their first stop was a small, sun-bleached wooden building with a crooked cross nailed to its peak. The sign, faded and peeling, read, St. Barley's Chapel. It was served by a circuit preacher who came through once a month. They found the chapel empty, smelling of dust and dry rot. On a small lectern near the altar was a heavy, leather-bound book, the marriage register. Colton opened it. The pages were filled with the spidery, elegant script of the traveling preacher, Father Donovan. They scanned the entries for the past 6 months. Names of ranchers, miners, and merchants filled the pages, a record of hope and new beginnings in a hard land. Alara's name was not there. The relief was a dizzying, physical wave. "It's not here," she breathed, tracing a blank line with her finger. "This is a start," Colton said, his face grim. "But it's not enough. Malloy's a snake. He'll have a way to explain this. He'll say he filed it directly with the county." Their next stop was the county clerk's office, a cramped, dusty room in the back of the land grant building. As they approached, they saw a man hurrying out the back door, stuffing a thick envelope into his coat. He was one of the men who had been with Malloy at the ranch. He didn't see them. A moment later, a weasel-faced man in a sweat-stained shirt, the county clerk, emerged, wiping his mouth and looking around nervously. He'd just been bribed. "Too late for that route," Colton muttered, pulling Alara back into the shadows of an alleyway. "They're trying to get a seal backdated. We need something better, something they can't fake." He looked at the main courthouse, a 2-story brick building that was the grandest structure in town. "The seal," he said, more to himself than to her. "Silas used the saloon's seal. If it's a registered business, a copy of that seal should be on file with the county." The keeper of the county records was a formidable woman named Mrs. Gable, a stern-faced widow in her late 60s with iron-gray hair pulled into a severe bun. She peered at them over her spectacles with an expression of deep and abiding suspicion. "The Registry of Official Seals and Marks is not a lending library," she stated, her voice as dry as old parchment. "It is for official business only." "This is official business," Colton said, his voice polite but firm. "I see no badge." "Mr. Hale?" she sniffed. Alara stepped forward. She knew that Colton's directness would only meet a wall of bureaucratic resistance. This required a different approach. "Ma'am?" she began, her voice quiet and respectful. "My name is Alara Finch. A man named Burke Malloy is in possession of a document that he claims is a legal bill of sale for my person, signed by my stepfather. It was stamped with the seal of the Copper Butte Saloon. I believe that seal may have been misused. I only wish to see the official copy on file, to compare it, to know the truth." She didn't plead or cry. She stated her case simply, her gaze direct, appealing not to the woman's pity, but to her sense of order, of propriety. Mrs. Gable studied her for a long, silent moment. She saw the raw burns on Alara's wrists, the quiet desperation in her eyes, and the defiant set of her chin. She saw something of herself, perhaps, a woman who had to be stronger than the world demanded. With a long, weary sigh, she turned and retrieved a massive, dust-covered ledger from a high shelf. "5 minutes," she said, laying it on the counter with a heavy thud. Alara's hands trembled as she opened the book. It was a history of the county told in stamps and seals. Ranches had their brands, merchants their logos, notaries their official marks. She found the entry for the Copper Butte Saloon. There it was, a simple, circular design with a stalk of wheat in the center, a grain seal. An ironic choice for a place that sold liquor. It was different. The memory of the seal on Malloy's paper was burned into her mind. That one had been similar, but the lines were thicker, cruder. The head of the wheat stalk had been slightly misshapen. The one in the book was finer, more detailed. "It's a forgery," she whispered, a surge of triumph making her lightheaded. It's not the same. Believing it and proving it are two different things, Colton said. He looked at Mrs. Gable. Ma'am, would you permit us to make a rubbing? Before the old woman could refuse, Elara produced a small nub of charcoal she'd taken from the hearth that morning and a thin piece of paper from her pocket. She laid the paper over the raised seal in the book and, with quick, deft strokes, began to rub the charcoal over it. A perfect dark image of the official seal appeared on the paper, a piece of irrefutable, tangible evidence. It was a rustic, simple trick, but in this moment, it felt like the sharpest legal maneuver in the world. As they were leaving the courthouse, their precious rubbing tucked safely away, a young woman carrying a basket of laundry nearly collided with them. She looked up, her eyes wide with fright, and then she recognized Elara. A flicker of something fear, recognition. Pity crossed her face. Elara knew her, vaguely. She worked at the general store. Mavis, Elara said. Mavis Doolin. The girl, Mavis, looked like a startled rabbit. She glanced around nervously, as if expecting to see Malloy's men on every corner. I heard what happened, she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. At your place, I'm glad you're safe. Something in the girl's terrified eyes sparked a connection. Mavis, Elara said, her voice low and urgent. Did they try it with you? Too? Was it your father, his gambling? Tears welled in Mavis's eyes. She gave a single, frantic nod. He owed Malloy. They had a paper. They were going to, but I ran. I ran to my aunt's in the next county for a month. When I came back, Malloy had moved on to someone else. She looked at Elara, her meaning horribly clear. Malloy had moved on to her. The pattern was now terrifyingly clear. This wasn't a single act of depravity, it was a system. That night, back at the ranch, the weight of their discovery settled over them. They had proof, but they needed to get it into the right hands. Colton sat at the table and wrote a short, concise letter. He didn't address it to the marshal's office. He addressed it to Abram. Abram, the debt marriage problem you're looking for is here. I have a witness and physical proof of forgery on a bill of sale. The man's name is Burke Malloy. He's running the scheme out of the Copper Butte Saloon with Silas Rook. The law in Perdition Gate is paid for. The real law needs to get here. When you come, bring the county's official book of seals. Colton. He sealed the letter and handed it to Elara. There's a rider who cuts across the North Range on his way to Fort Union. He's honest. Give this to him at sunup. It'll get to Pike in 2 days. As he stood, a thought struck him. There's a public ledger at the courthouse, a record of liens and business debts. We should have checked it. Elara's blood ran cold. The next day, she rode back to Perdition Gate alone. She told Colton she needed supplies, but her true purpose was a knot of dread in her stomach. She had to know. Mrs. Gable, seeing her again, simply pointed to the correct ledger without a word. She found what she was looking for in less than a minute. Under a list of debts owed against the Copper Butte Saloon, there was a series of entries. They were not debts Silas Rook owed. They were payments he had received. From Burke Malloy. Each payment was listed next to the name of a local man known for his gambling, and a notation for introduction and arrangement. Silas Rook was not a victim. He hadn't lost her in a desperate, drunken wager. He had been Malloy's partner. He was a broker, identifying vulnerable men, pushing them into debt, and then offering them a way out their daughters. He had sold her, deliberately. The truth was a poison, seeping into every memory she had of her stepfather. The sickness rose in her throat. She left the courthouse, her body numb, her mind reeling. She walked blindly towards the town's main square. On a public notice board, a weathered piece of paper announced a town dance, sponsored by the generous merchants of the community. The first name on the list of sponsors was Silas Rook. She looked at his name, at the flourish of his signature. It was the signature of a man who saw himself as a pillar of the community, a man who traded in human flesh and then sponsored dances. With a sudden, sharp movement, she reached up and tore the notice from the board. She ripped the paper into small, angry pieces. letting the wind snatch them from her fingers and scatter them into the dust. It was not an act of revenge, it was an act of severance. She was not his debt. She was not his daughter. She was not his shame to carry. She was Alara Finch, and she was going to burn their whole corrupt world to the ground. The prediction Colton had made came to pass not as a gradual shift, but as a violent occupation. The distant thunder had rumbled for a day, a restless giant pacing the far side of the mountains. Then, in the late afternoon, the world went still. The wind died. The air became thick, heavy, and metallic, carrying the scent of ozone and dust. A bruised, yellowish-gray light washed all the color from the ranch, as if the land were holding its breath. They had been working to secure the ranch against the coming deluge. Colton was reinforcing a loose shutter on the main house while Alara, now competent and sure-footed, was driving the small flock of sheep into the shelter of the newly repaired pen. She had just slid the heavy wooden bar into place when the sky tore open. There was no gentle precursor, no polite sprinkling. The first drops were the size of bullets, striking the hard-baked earth with audible thwacks. A heartbeat later, the sky fell. A solid, deafening sheet of water crashed down, instantly turning the dusty yard into a roiling, muddy soup. The wind returned with a shriek, driving the rain sideways. The barn. Colton's voice was a sharp command, barely audible over the sudden, violent roar. The loft door might not hold. He grabbed her hand, not in anger, but in pure, practical urgency. And they ran. They sprinted across the yard, the mud sucking at their boots, the rain so cold it stung their skin. They tumbled into the cavernous, dry darkness of the barn just as a crack of lightning split the sky, followed by a clap of thunder so immediate and so loud it shook the very foundations of the building. Panting, soaked, and temporarily deafened, they leaned against the interior wall. The sound inside the barn was terrifying and magnificent. The rain hammered on the vast tin roof, not as a patter, but as a continuous, deafening drum roll. 1,000 frantic hands beating against the metal. It was a sound so overwhelming it seemed to swallow all other thought. "The loft," Colton yelled, pointing upwards. The high winds could tear the big door from its runners. He led the way up the sturdy ladder. The hayloft was dim, but a lantern, kept there for evening chores, sat on a barrel. Colton struck a match, the small flames struggling against the sudden drafts, and lit the wick. A warm golden light pushed back against the violent gray gloom pouring in through the gaps in the walls. The air up here was thick with the sweet, dry, dusty scent of cured hay. It was an island of warmth and earthy peace in the center of the world's fury. The main loft door, a massive sliding panel that opened to the outside, was rattling and shuddering in its wooden track, threatening to break free. Together, they strained to push a heavy crossbeam into place, bracing it against the wind. When it was secure, the violent shuddering eased, though the roar of the storm outside was undiminished. They were trapped. The rain was not a passing shower. It was a season-changing event. The yard below was already a shallow, fast-moving lake. Going back to the house was impossible. Alara walked to a smaller, reinforced window on the leeward side of the barn. She stared out at the chaos, the world she had known just moments before. All hard edges, sharp rocks, and choking dust was gone. It had been washed away, dissolved into a gray, watery blur. It was a landscape remade. Colton stood several feet away, watching the newly secured loft door, his body still tense, listening to the symphony of destruction outside. He was a man perpetually on watch, his mind always tracking potential threats. The sound of the rain was a wall, isolating them, cocooning them in the warm, hay-scented dimness. Alara felt her own tension, the coil of fear that had lived in her stomach for weeks, begin to unclench. Malloy would not come in this. Not even his particular brand of malice could ride through a gully washer like this. For the first time, she felt a different kind of safety. Not the safety of high walls or a loaded gun, but the safety of impossibility. The world, for now, was simply held at bay. She turned from the window, her gaze falling on Colton. He stood half in shadow, half in the golden lantern light, his damp hair plastered to his forehead, the lines of his face stark and weary. He had been her protector, her teacher, her silent partner. He had treated her not as a broken thing, as property, or as a burden, but as a person. He had given her tools. He had given her knowledge, and most importantly, he had given her his respect. He had never once crossed the lines she drew around herself. A thought, fragile and terrifying, uncurled in her mind. It was a thought born of the new self she had been building, plank by plank, knot by knot, here on this ranch. She was no longer just a thing that ran from. She was, perhaps, becoming a person who could move toward. She spoke, her voice so quiet it was almost lost in the storm. She had to clear her throat and try again, this time a little louder, though the sound was still fragile. Colton. He turned, his attention pulled from the storm. The full force of his quiet gaze fell on her, and she had to fight the urge to look away. That paper, she began, her fingers twisting together, the one Malloy has, the marriage, it was a lie. You know it was a lie. He nodded slowly, his expression unreadable, just waiting. It was a lie in every way, she whispered, her gaze dropping to the floor. Not just the seal, not just the preacher, all of it. She took a shuddering breath, forcing herself to meet his eyes again. The confession was a heavy stone she had to lift. I've never, the way he meant it, the way Silas, I've never been with anyone. Colton, not once. The admission hung in the air, shockingly intimate, laid bare in the tiny golden world of the hayloft. She saw him react. He didn't move, but his entire body went utterly still. He froze, just as the outline of her memory had suggested. It was not a freeze of indifference, but of sudden, profound shock. His breath hitched, almost imperceptibly. He was a man who dealt in facts, in fence posts and cattle, and she had just handed him the most fragile, intangible truth she possessed. She had said her piece. She had shown him the last, hidden, vulnerable part of her. But there was one more step to take. Her voice trembled, but she held his gaze, refusing to let him see her as a victim. This was not a confession of weakness. It was a declaration of choice. But what if I wanted to? There it was, the question, the offer, the terrifying, beautiful, sovereign choice. Colton's jaw tightened. He looked away from her, just for a second, his gaze fixed on the lantern flame. He was processing the immensity of her trust, the weight of the responsibility she was placing in his hands. He, who lived by rules of honor and distance, was being invited past the last and most important boundary. One wrong word, one wrong move, and he could shatter this new, brave person she was becoming. He took a long, slow breath, the sound of it a counterpoint to the rain's frantic drumming. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, rougher than usual, but perfectly steady. He met her eyes, and in them, she saw no judgment, no avarice, no pity. She saw only a deep, profound, and aching respect. Elara, he said, and the use of her name, so rare for him, struck her like a touch. We will only ever do what we both truly want, and only when you feel completely safe. He took a half step closer, his gaze searching hers, not just safe from the storm or from Malloy, safe with me. Nothing happens that you don't ask for first. Nothing. He had done it. He had heard her true question, which was not about a physical act, but about her own power to choose, and he had answered it perfectly. He had given the power, all of it, right back to her. She was shivering, though whether from the cold, damp air, or the force of her own emotion, she didn't know. Colton turned and unhooked his heavy oilskin slicker from a peg where he'd hung it to dry. It was stiff, smelling faintly of linseed oil in the cold rain. He didn't reach for her. He simply stepped forward and draped it over her shoulders. The weight of it was immediate, grounding. It was a shield, warm from his body, an act of pure, uncomplicated care. He motioned to a pile of clean, dry hay in the corner, away from the rattling door. "The storm's not letting up. We should sit." He sat first, leaning his back against a support beam, leaving a respectable distance between them. He was proving his words. He was waiting. He gave her the time, and the space, to make the next choice. Elara pulled the heavy slicker around her, the warmth seeping into her skin. She sat beside him, not touching, but close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his side. They sat in silence for a long time, the roar of the rain on the roof their only conversation. It was a comfortable silence now, charged with a new, unspoken understanding. Finally, slowly, Elara turned her hand over, palm up, on the hay between them, a simple, quiet invitation. She watched his hand as he, just as slowly, moved it and placed it on top of hers. His skin was rough, calloused, his hand large and solid. It did not close over hers. It simply rested there, a connection. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She leaned her head, just slightly, until her temple rested against his shoulder. It was solid, unyielding, and in that moment, the safest place on earth. "I was always afraid," she whispered, her voice muffled against his shirt. "Before I came here, I was afraid of what they would do. I was afraid of what Silas would say. I was afraid of being seen." "I know," he rumbled, his voice vibrating through his chest into her ear. "But I'm not afraid right now. Colton, I'm not afraid of you." He turned his head, his face now very close to hers. His breath was warm. He was watching her, his dark eyes searching hers in the lamplight. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. This time, it was he who moved, but with infinite, painstaking slowness. He telegraphed the motion, giving her every chance to pull away, to turn her head. He raised his free hand, the one that wasn't covering hers, and his rough fingers gently, tentatively, brushed a strand of damp hair from her cheek. His touch was feather-light, almost hesitant. She didn't flinch. She leaned into it, a small, involuntary movement of acceptance. That was all the answer he needed. He leaned in and pressed his mouth to hers. The kiss was slow and gentle and profoundly respectful. It was not a kiss of pent-up passion or sudden, desperate need. It was a kiss of acknowledgement. It was quiet and warm, and it tasted of the rain-scented air and the faint, clean trace of lye soap. It was a promise. It was a question and an answer in one. It was the first kiss of her life, and it was not something taken from her, but something she was actively, freely, and joyfully giving. The world outside, with its thunder and its rage, dissolved. There was only the warmth, the safety, and this quiet, solid man. The kiss deepened, just a fraction, a mutual, gentle exploration. It was still soft, still achingly tender. And then, a tiny, faint sound cut through the roar. Tinkle, tinkle. It was so small, so high-pitched, that it was almost lost. But they both heard it. The small brass bell on the front door of the house, rattled by the force of the wind vibrating the very doorframe. They stopped. They pulled back, slowly, their foreheads resting against each other. They weren't panicked. They weren't startled. It was simply a reminder that the house was still there, that the world was still there, that the danger, while held at bay by the storm, was still a real and present thing. Their fight was not over. This moment, this beautiful, stolen moment, was not an end, but a beginning. It could not make them blind or reckless. A slow smile spread across Elara's face, her cheeks flushed, her eyes bright in the lamplight. She wasn't disappointed by the interruption. She was affirmed by it. She looked at him, her heart so full it felt like it might burst. "When I first came here," she said, her voice soft and full of a new, warm confidence, "I told you. Get inside first. I was talking about the house. But I think, first, It was about trust. Colton's own rare smile touched his lips. He lifted his hand from hers, and this time, his fingers laced firmly, securely, with her own. "And that trust," he replied, his voice a low, possessive growl that sent a shiver of warmth through her, "is yours. It always was." They both laughed, a soft, shared sound of pure, unadulterated relief. The tension was gone, replaced by a deep, abiding affection that was as solid as the barn beams around them. Colton released her hand and stood, pulling the slicker straight. He spread it carefully over a thick pile of clean hay, making a dry, comfortable seat for them. "The rain's not stopping," he said, his voice practical once more, though the warmth in it remained. "We sit, we listen, we wait." Elara sat down on the slicker, and he sat beside her, their shoulders touching, their bodies aligned against the storm. The imagined camera of the moment pulled back, pulling away from their small, intimate space. It drifted up into the high, dark rafters, looking down on the two figures, illuminated in a tiny, perfect circle of golden lantern light. They sat in the heart of the massive, dark barn, a fortress against the howling gray tempest outside. They just sat, listening to the rain, safe in the shelter they had built together. And in the warm, hay-scented darkness, his hand found hers, their fingers interlaced, a silent, powerful, and binding grip. It was a promise made, a bond sealed. The scene held on that, on their joined hands, a quiet testament to a passion born not of impulse, but of profound, hard-won trust. The rain washed the world clean. It scoured the dust from the air, darkened the timber of the barn and the house, and left the Lost Comet Ranch glistening under a pale, uncertain sun. The ground was soft, the air smelled of wet sage and clean earth, and for the first time in days, the horizon was sharp and clear. It was a world reborn, holding its breath in the quiet aftermath of the storm. The quiet was broken by the steady, rhythmic beat of a single horse, moving at an official, unhurried pace. It was not the arrogant thunder of Malloy's crew, nor the skittish canter of a spooked animal. This was the sound of purpose. Elara and Colton stood on the porch, watching the rider approach. He was a tall man, straight-backed in the saddle, wearing the plain, durable clothes of a traveler, not a lawman's uniform, but as he drew closer, the sun glinted off the small, five-pointed star pinned to his vest. It wasn't polished or ornate. It was silver, scratched and worn by years of service, a tool of his trade, not an ornament. He reined in his horse at the gate and dismounted, his movements economical and sure. He had a lean, weathered face, with eyes that had seen too much to be easily surprised. He took in the scene, Colton standing on the porch, Elara a half-step behind him with a single, sweeping glance that missed nothing. "Colton," the man said, his voice a low baritone, as dry as the dust the rain had just washed away. "Abram," Colton replied. He walked down the steps, his hand extended. The handshake was firm, brief. It was followed by a hard, quick embrace, the kind of rough, shoulder-clapping hug shared by men who have relied on each other in dangerous places and have no need for effusive sentiment. The gesture spoke of a deep, shared history. The marshal, Abram Pike, released him and his gaze shifted to Elara. His eyes, which had been warm with recognition for his friend, became cool, professional, and serious. He did not dismiss her. He did not look at her with pity. He looked at her as if she were the sole reason he had ridden for 3 days. "Ma'am," he said, touching the brim of his hat, "Hale's letter said you have a story for me." Before Elara could speak, the sound of more horses reached them, this time from the direction of Copper Butte. It was an undisciplined, lurching sound. A moment later, Burke Malloy appeared, followed by the 2 henchmen Elara recognized from the saloon, the witnesses. They were both red-faced and slumped in their saddles, reeking of cheap whiskey even from 50 feet away. Malloy, however, was sober, his face a mask of smug, vindictive triumph. He clearly believed the marshal's presence was the answer to his prayers. He rode his horse directly into the yard, a blatant act of trespass, and pulled up, sneering at the scene on the porch. Well, Marshal Pike, glad you could make it. Saves me the trouble of filing a complaint. This man, Hale, assaulted me and is illegally harboring my property. He gestured with a dismissive flick of his head towards Alara, my wife. Pike's expression did not change. He turned his cool, appraising gaze on Malloy. A serious charge. Mr. Malloy, I assume you have proof of this marriage? I do, Malloy boomed, reaching into his coat with a theatrical flourish. He produced the stained, creased bill of sale, signed, witnessed, and sealed, all legal and proper. Pike took the document. He didn't just glance at it. He held it up to the light, studied the ink, the hurried, shaky signature that was Alara's. He ran his thumb over the wax seal, the seal of the Copper Butte Saloon. I see. That's right, Malloy said, puffing out his chest. Official business seal. Makes it binding. Colton stepped forward. From a leather pouch at his belt, he produced the thin piece of paper bearing the charcoal rubbing. Marshal, this is a rubbing of the official seal on file at the county courthouse in Perdition Gate. He handed it to Pike. Pike held the two side by side, the crude, waxy impression on Malloy's document, and the clear, detailed rubbing from the official ledger. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. The two drunken witnesses swayed in their saddles, looking confused. The grooves in the official seal are finer, Pike said, his voice flat and factual. The fletching on the wheat stalk has 4 distinct lines. Your seal, Mr. Malloy, has 3, and they're thick, as if carved with a dull knife. The shape of the grain head is different. This, he tapped the bill of sale, is a forgery, and not a very good one. Malloy's face, which had been smug, turned a mottled, angry red. That's a lie. It's the same seal. The clerk in Perdition Gate can verify it. The clerk who you paid to backdate your filing, Pike asked, his voice still dangerously calm. I had a talk with him on my way through town. He was surprisingly eager to cooperate once I mentioned federal mail fraud statutes. A carriage, drawn by 2 tired-looking horses, suddenly rattled into the yard. From it, a man in a slightly too fine suit and a ridiculous bowler hat climbed down. It was Silas Rook. He scurried forward, his face a mask of false sincerity and concern. Marshal Pike. Thank heavens, he exclaimed, wringing his hands. There seems to be a terrible misunderstanding here. A simple business arrangement that has gotten out of hand. I'm sure we can come to a settlement that is agreeable to all parties. He glanced at Alara, his eyes cold and dismissive. Alara is a good girl, but emotional, a singing burden, you might say. She never understood practical matters. The words were meant to cut her, to reduce her to a foolish, hysterical child in the eyes of the law. But the Alara who had rebuilt a sheep pen and learned to read the night sky and face down armed men was no longer that child. She stepped forward, moving from behind Colton's protective shadow to stand at the edge of the porch, level with Pike. Her voice, when she spoke, was not loud, but it was as clear and cold as a winter morning. It was not a misunderstanding. Silas, she said, her use of his first name a deliberate severing of their familial tie. And it was not a business arrangement. It was a dark, foul-smelling grain shed. There was no minister. The man you called Padre was Johnny Fingers Malone, your faro dealer. He was holding a bottle of whiskey, not a Bible. And your witness. She pointed to one of the drunken men, held a pistol with the hammer cocked while you forced a pen into my hand. She looked directly at Pike. That is not a marriage, Marshal. That is a threat. That is coercion. Her testimony, delivered without tears or theatrics, landed with the force of a physical blow. The simple, brutal details painted a picture of squalor and criminality that no forged seal could disguise. Pike's gaze was hard as flint. Is Father Donovan here? He called out. From the shade of a large juniper tree near the road, a stooped, elderly man in the dusty black garb of a circuit preacher stepped forward. It was the real Father Donovan. He had ridden in with the marshal. Father, Pike said respectfully, Have you, at any time in the last year, presided over the marriage of this woman, Elara Finch, to this man, Burke Malloy?" The old priest peered at Elara over his spectacles, his eyes kind. Then he looked at Malloy with an expression of profound distaste. "Marshal," he said, his voice thin but firm, "I have never laid eyes on that man before in my life, and I would certainly remember a union involving this young lady. Her name does not appear in my register." He held up the heavy, leather-bound book from his chapel. "It's a lie. She's a liar," Burke bellowed, his composure finally shattering. He was a cornered animal, lashing out. "I have a signed document. She is my property. I'll sue you. Hale, I'll sue you for theft. I'll own this cursed ranch." Pike held up a hand, and the gesture had the immediate, silencing effect of a gunshot. "You'll do no such thing, Mr. Malloy." He reached into his own saddlebag and produced a small, worn, leather-bound book. He opened it to a page he had already marked. "Territorial Statute 113, Section B," Pike read, his voice ringing with cold. "Legal authority. Any contract, bill of sale, or other instrument which purports to transfer the ownership, servitude, or marital bonds of a person in settlement of a financial debt shall be considered null and void. Furthermore, any party found to have coerced, threatened, or otherwise forced an individual into such an arrangement shall be guilty of trafficking in persons, a federal crime punishable by no less than 20 years of hard labor." The words 20 years seemed to suck all the air out of the yard. Malloy's face went from red to a pasty, sickly white. The drunken witnesses were suddenly, shockingly sober. Silas Rook saw the world he had built on the weakness of others collapsing around him. His oily charm vanished, replaced by a raw, ugly spite. His gaze fell on Elara, the cause of his ruin. His face twisted into a sneer of pure hatred. He took a step forward, drew in a breath, and spat on the ground, a thick, contemptuous glob of spittle landing in the dirt just inches from the toe of her borrowed boot. Colton moved. It was not a step, but a coil of pure, violent intent. His hands clenched into fists, the muscles in his neck cording, every instinct, every fiber of his being, screamed at him to cross the space between them and smash the smug, vile expression from Rook's face. "Colton, stand down." Pike's voice was soft, but it was a command of iron. Colton froze, his body trembling with the effort of his restraint. He was a breath away from unleashing a storm of his own, but he held. He trusted Pike. He trusted the law. Elara did not flinch. She did not recoil or cry out. She looked down at the spittle in the dirt, then lifted her head and looked directly into Silas Rook's eyes. She said nothing. She simply held his gaze, and in her own, there was no fear, no pain. There was only a vast, cold, and bottomless contempt. She had won, not by throwing a punch or firing a gun, but by surviving, by speaking the truth, and by refusing to be diminished by his filth. She held his gaze until he, the abuser, the broker of human misery, was the one who had to look away. She had won with her dignity intact. Pike closed his small book with a decisive snap. The sound was like a cell door slamming shut. His gaze swept over the guilty parties, his face a mask of cold justice. "Mavis Doolin has already given me her sworn statement regarding your arrangements, Mr. Rook," he said, his voice cutting through the silence. He turned his attention back to Malloy. "Elara Finch," he declared, his voice ringing out across the yard, "is a free woman under the protection of the law. She is owed restitution for her ordeal, which will be assessed against Mr. Rook's assets." He then looked directly at Malloy, and all pretense of judicial calm was gone from his eyes, replaced by a hard, frontier disgust. "Burke Malloy, you are under arrest for forgery, coercion, and conspiracy to commit human trafficking. As for you two," he glared at the terrified witnesses, "you'll be held as material witnesses. Start talking now, and I might consider that when I speak to the judge." He drew his pistol, its long barrel gleaming in the sun. The sound of the hammer being cocked was the final, definitive punctuation mark on the proceedings. Justice, rough and swift, had finally come to the Lost Comet Ranch. Justice in the territories did not arrive with the slow, grinding certainty of a courthouse clock. It came like the flash flood, a sudden, violent scouring that receded just as quickly, leaving a landscape altered in its wake. Marshal Pike, having secured his prisoners, had departed for the federal jail at Fort Union, leaving behind 2 newly deputized men from Perdition Gate to stand watch. But the law's presence was a thin veneer over a deep well of malice. Burke Malloy was in chains, but the poison he had spread remained. He had men loyal to him not through principle, but through shared greed and a taste for cruelty. Men who were now leaderless, furious, and drunk. Night fell on the Lost Comet Ranch, a deep, starless black that seemed to press down on the damp earth. A false quiet settled, the kind that precedes an attack. Colton, Elara, and their 2 new guards. A young, earnest farmhand named Silas and an older, quiet man named Peter ate a cold meal on the porch, their rifles always within reach. Mavis Doolin, too frightened to return to town, had stayed, making herself useful by organizing supplies and keeping watch from an upstairs window. The attack came just before midnight. It was not a frontal assault, it was the work of cowards. A single triumphant shout of "For Burke" echoed from the darkness, followed by the sound of galloping horses riding away. And then, a flicker of orange light against the dark timber of the main barn. The flicker became a lick, then a hungry roar, a Molotov, a whiskey bottle stuffed with a kerosene-soaked rag, had been hurled against the dry, hay-filled structure. The flames, fed by a sudden gust of wind, climbed the wall with terrifying speed, casting a dancing, demonic light across the entire ranch. The heart of their sanctuary was being consumed. For a moment, they were paralyzed by the sheer destructive beauty of it. Then, training and instinct took over. Peter, Silas, the well. Colton's voice was a whip crack, cutting through the horrified silence. Bucket Brigade Mavis, get down here and help them, Elara. With me. He didn't run towards the fire. He ran towards the chaos. The cattle, terrified by the light and the smell of smoke, were stampeding in their pasture, a frantic, mindless wave of horns and hooves. Any other rancher would have seen them as another liability, another asset to be lost. Colton Hale saw them as a tool. The creek, he yelled to Elara as they ran towards the pasture fence. The rain last night. It's full. We can use them to make a fire break. Elara understood instantly. The recent downpour had turned the normally dry creek bed that bordered the north pasture into a wide, muddy bog, a natural barrier that the fire, driven by the south wind, could not cross. Their only hope was to contain the blaze, to let the barn burn but save the rest of the ranch. While Colton vaulted the fence, his familiar calls cutting through the panicked bellows of the herd, Elara sprinted to the small shed where the tools were kept. Her mind was a whirl of cold, clear calculation. She was not the terrified girl who had collapsed at the gate. She was a woman who knew the layout of this ranch as well as she knew the lines on her own hands. She knew where the buckets were, where the pump handle was stored, where the weaknesses in the fence lay. At the well, Peter and young Silas were fumbling in the dark, their movements clumsy with panic. Elara arrived like a whirlwind of purpose. Silas, get the handle on the pump, Peter. Grab those 2 buckets by the trough. Mavis, you're the strongest. You start the chain to the house. We're not saving the barn. We're saving the house. Wet down the walls. Her voice, sharp with an authority she didn't know she possessed, galvanized them. Mavis, her face pale but determined, grabbed 2 buckets and ran. Silas fitted the long iron handle into the pump, and soon the rhythmic, squealing complaint of the pump handle began, a desperate heartbeat in the fiery night. Meanwhile, in the pasture, Colton was a master of controlled chaos. He rode his gelding bareback, a dark silhouette against the inferno. his voice a low, calming rumble that somehow penetrated the cattle's terror. He wasn't driving them from behind, he was leading them, positioning himself at the head of the herd, turning their stampede into a controlled, thundering river of livestock. He pushed them north, away from the fire, their hooves churning the soft, damp earth into a wide, muddy scar. They poured into the swollen creek bed, their momentum carrying them through the water and up the other side, a living wall of flesh and panic moving away from the flames. The fire break was made. Back at the house, Alara worked the pump handle, her arms and back screaming with the effort. The repetitive, back-breaking motion was a prayer, a punishment, a declaration of will. Squeak thump, water gushed into the buckets. Mavis, Peter, and Silas worked in a frantic, sloppy rhythm, sloshing water against the side of the house, the cool hiss of it a small, defiant sound against the roar of the burning barn. Suddenly, a shape detached itself from the shadows near the corral. It was a man. One of Malloy's crew who had stayed behind. He had a wild look in his eyes, his face illuminated by the firelight. He had likely been sent to make sure the fire took hold, to sow more chaos. He saw Alara, alone at the pump, her attention focused on her task. To him, she was the cause of it all, an easy target for his rage. He started towards her, a long knife glinting in his hand. "You," he snarled, "this is all your fault, you little witch." Alara saw him coming. Her heart leaped into her throat, but there was no time for fear. The rifle was in the house. The others were too far away. She was alone. Her eyes darted around, searching for a weapon. There was nothing but the pump and the open ground, and a long, heavy wooden ladder leaning against the side of the shed. She kept pumping, her rhythm steady, not letting him see her panic. Squeak thump, she watched him approach, his steps unsteady in the mud. He was 10 feet away. 5. Just as he lunged, she let go of the pump handle. In a single, fluid motion, she pivoted, grabbed the bottom of the heavy ladder, and heaved. She didn't try to lift it. She used its length as a lever, planting the base in the mud and shoving the top sideways. The man, expecting her to run, was completely unprepared. The top of the long, heavy ladder swung in a wide, sweeping arc and caught him squarely in the chest. The force of the blow knocked him off his feet, his arms windmilling. He landed with a thick, wet splash in a deep puddle of muddy water, the knife flying from his grasp. He came up sputtering, covered in mud. The fight knocked out of him. Before he could recover, the thunder of new hoofbeats organized. Purposeful erupted into the yard. 2 riders swept in, their pistols drawn. It was Marshal Pike and one of his deputies. He had, as Colton suspected he would, anticipated a reprisal. Pike took in the scene in an instant: the burning barn, the bucket brigade, Alara standing over a mud-caked arsonist, the ladder still in her hands. A flicker of grim admiration crossed his face. "Seems you had this handled, ma'am," he called out. His deputy dismounted, hauling Alara's assailant to his feet. They found 2 more men trying to light a fire near the sheep pen and quickly subdued them. They didn't use their own ropes. Pike, with a sense of grim, practical irony, made them pull a length of wire from the fence Alara and Colton had mended. He had them truss the arsonists up with their own handiwork. And then, as if on cue from some celestial stage director, the sky opened up once more. A second, gentler rain began to fall. It was not the violent deluge of the day before, but a steady, hissing downpour. It fell on the fire with a great, sighing sound, sending up enormous plumes of steam and smoke. It fell on the tin roof of the main house, the steady drumming no longer a sound of fury, but of applause. It fell on their upturned faces, washing away the soot and the sweat, a cool, clean blessing. The fire was dying, the threat was over. In the chaotic effort to save the house, a piece of burning timber had fallen from the barn roof, landing near Colton as he worked to calm the last of the herd. He had leaped back, stumbling over a loose rock, his arms scraping hard against its sharp edge. It wasn't a serious wound, but it was long and deep, bleeding sluggishly in the rain. He stumbled back towards the house, exhausted and grim. Alara met him on the porch, a basin of clean water and strips of linen in her hands. She said nothing. She gently took his arm and began to clean the wound. Her hands, which had once fumbled with a simple clove hitch, were now steady and sure. Her touch was gentle but firm, her movements efficient. She cleaned the grit from the scrape, applied a salve, and wrapped the wound neatly. As she tied the final knot, her fingers sure and practiced, he looked down at her bent head, at the way the lantern light caught the rain in her hair, and a feeling of profound, quiet gratitude filled him. Just then, a low, pitiful bleating sound came from the direction of the smoldering barn. A small calf, born just a week before, had been separated from its mother in the chaos and had somehow gotten itself trapped in the muddy ditch near the sheep pen. It was weak, shivering, and crying for its mother. Without a word, Colton and Alara moved together. They waded into the muck, and together they heaved the small, trembling animal out of the ditch. Alara wrapped her arms around its neck, calming it with soft words, while Colton gently guided it back towards the herd, where its mother was already lowing in distress. It was a small thing, in the grand scheme of the night's violence, but as they watched the calf reunite with its mother, the simple, powerful act of saving this one small, innocent life felt like the most important victory of all. It was a testament not to what they had destroyed, but to what they had managed to save. Dawn broke, gray and wet. The rain had stopped. Thin wisps of smoke curled up from the blackened, skeletal ruins of the barn. The only sound the slow, steady drip of water from the eaves of the house. The air was scoured clean, smelling of wet ash and new beginnings. Alara walked through the muddy yard, her gaze fixed on the ruins. Something white, curled and blackened at the edges, lay in a pile of wet ashes. She bent down and picked it up. It was a playing card, the ace of diamonds, Burke Malloy's symbol. His brand of ownership was now just a piece of charred, pathetic paper. The fire had consumed the last vestiges of his power. She looked up from the ruined card, her gaze sweeping across the green, rain-washed pasture, at the solid, standing house, at the quiet, steady mountains on the horizon. A profound, bone-deep sense of peace settled over her. She took a deep breath of the clean, cool air. "My debt," she whispered to the morning, her voice quiet but strong. The words meant only for herself. "My debt to fear, it's paid." A week after the fire, the town of Juniper Flats decided it was time for a celebration. It wasn't for any particular holiday. It was a collective, unspoken acknowledgement that they had weathered a series of storms, both literal and figurative, and had emerged on the other side, scarred but standing. The rains that had doused the flames at the Lost Comet Ranch had also filled the cisterns, revived the pastures, and washed the ever-present dust from the air, leaving the world looking sharp-edged and new. So they held the annual Harvest Festival a month early. Strings of paper lanterns, salvaged and carefully mended, were strung between the awnings of the general store and the blacksmith shop, their soft, warm glow pushing back the sharp, cool shadows of the evening. The air, usually thick with the scent of dust and livestock, was now rich with the smells of roasting corn, sweet apple pies, and the smoky, savory aroma of pit-cooked beef. From a makeshift stage in the center of the town's only street, the cheerful, slightly off-key sound of a fiddle sawed through the murmur of the crowd, playing a lively tune that made children clap their hands and old men tap their toes. It was a town breathing a sigh of relief. Alara stood on the porch of the ranch house, her hands smoothing the front of a dress she hadn't known existed. Mavis, in an act of profound gratitude and friendship, had brought it to her. It wasn't new. It was a simple, well-made garment of soft, blue calico, the color of the sky after a storm. It had belonged to Mavis's mother. Wearing it felt like being wrapped in a quiet, unassuming kindness. After weeks in borrowed men's clothing, The feel of the soft fabric against her skin was both strange and wonderful. It was the dress of a free woman. The door opened behind her. Colton stepped out onto the porch. He had scrubbed his face and hands until they were raw, and his dark hair was still damp and neatly combed. He wore a clean muslin shirt, the one with the small, carefully mended tear near the collar that Alara had stitched herself, and on his feet, he wore the same scarred, old work boots she had first seen on the floor of his kitchen, but he had taken the time to clean and polish them until the worn leather held a deep, dull shine. He had made an effort, for her. He didn't speak, he just looked at her, his gaze traveling from the simple braid in her hair down to the hem of the blue dress. A slow, quiet approval softened the hard lines of his face. He extended his hand, palm up, a silent question. She placed her hand in his. His grasp was warm, solid, and sure, and together, they walked to the wagon. When they arrived, the festival was in full swing. The lanterns cast a magical glow, and the faces of the townspeople seemed softer, kinder. People nodded to Colton, their greetings respectful, but their eyes were on Alara. Their gazes were curious, but not unkind. The story of the fire, of the marshal, of her stand against Malloy and Rook, had become the stuff of local legend. She was no longer a victim or a fugitive. She was the woman from the Lost Comet Ranch. Marshal Pike, who had returned to Juniper Flats to finalize his report, saw them arrive. He strode over, a tin cup of cider in his hand, a genuine smile on his weathered face. He nodded to them both. "Hail, ma'am." He looked around at the cheerful scene, then back at the quiet rancher and the woman by his side. "It's good to see," he said, his meaning encompassing more than just the festival. He took a sip of cider, a teasing glint in his eye. "You know, Colton," he said, his voice a low, conspiratorial rumble. "This ranch of yours is a fine place, solid, but it's always been a little too quiet. Maybe what it needs is a bit more singing in the morning." Alara felt a hot blush spread up her neck and across her cheeks. She remembered her stepfather's cruel words, a singing burden, and for a fleeting second, the old shame threatened to surface. But then she looked at Colton, who was watching her, a faint, almost imperceptible smile playing on his lips, and she looked at Pike, whose eyes were filled with a gruff, fatherly kindness. He wasn't mocking her, he was welcoming her. He was acknowledging her place in Colton's life, in the life of the ranch. The blush remained, but it was no longer the blush of shame. It was the blush of happiness. She ducked her head and laughed, a soft, clear sound that mingled with the fiddle music. Later, they saw Mavis Doolin, her face bright with a newfound confidence. She rushed over, her hands full of letters. "They gave me a job," she announced, her voice full of pride. "At the post office, sorting the mail. It's official work." She looked at Alara, her expression turning serious. "And I'm going to do more than sort letters. Every woman who comes in, every girl my age, I'm going to tell them what to watch for. I'll tell them about men who make wagers with what isn't theirs to bet. There will be no more debt marriages in this county, not if I can help it." She was no longer a frightened victim, but a guardian, a small, determined soldier in a quiet war. As they passed the blacksmith shop, the smith himself, a mountain of a man named Gus, wiped his sooty hands on his leather apron and hailed them. "Miss Finch," he said, his voice a deep, rumbling bass. He held out a small, cloth-wrapped object. "This is for you." Alara unwrapped it. Inside was a small, beautifully crafted knife. It was not a weapon of war, but a tool, the kind a person might use for carving wood, or cutting twine, or peeling an apple. The handle was made of polished juniper wood, and into the silver bolster at the end of the handle, a single, elegant letter had been engraved F. "F for Finch," Gus said, his gruff voice softened with respect. "A good name, a strong name, it's yours. Don't let anyone ever tell you otherwise." Tears pricked at Alara's eyes. It was more than a gift. The blacksmith was giving her back her identity, her family name, cleansed of all the shame Silas Rook had tried to attach to it. She clutched the small knife in her hand, the wood warm and solid. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Before they left town, Colton stopped at a small table where the church ladies were selling donated goods to raise money for a new schoolhouse. His eyes scanned the collection of worn-out tools and chipped crockery. He stopped at a small stack of books. He picked one up. It was an old Bible, its leather cover cracked and soft as doeskin, its pages thin and yellowed with age. He paid the woman a few coins and tucked it under his arm. Back at the ranch that night, Alara saw him place the book not on a shelf, but in the very center of the big wooden table where they ate their meals. She looked at him, a question in her eyes. "It's not for swearing oaths on," he said, understanding her unspoken thought. "It's a reminder that some things, some words, are supposed to be respected, that a home should have a foundation." He wasn't talking about faith in a way a preacher might. He was talking about the moral foundation of their life together, a silent testament to the principles of decency and honor that he had demonstrated from the moment she had arrived at his gate. The fiddle player had started a new song, a slow, melodic two-step. Colton turned to her. "I'm not much of a dancer," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Neither am I," she replied, her heart starting to beat a little faster. "Would you try with me?" he asked. She nodded, and he led her into the cleared space in the street. He placed one hand on her waist and took her hand with his other. His touch was hesitant, respectful. They began to move, their steps clumsy at first, then finding a slow, easy rhythm. They didn't talk. They just danced, their movements careful and deliberate, a mirror of the way they had built their trust, step by careful step. They were not two separate people anymore, but a partnership, moving as one in the warm, golden light of the paper lanterns. The next day, the world felt quiet and full of promise. The sun was warm on their backs as they walked the property line, checking for any damage the rains might have caused. Their path took them along the edge of Painted Gull Wash, the creek, which had been a dry, dusty scar in the earth when Alara first arrived, was now full, the water running clear and swift over the smooth, gray stones. The sound of it was a happy, bubbling murmur. To cross to the other side, they had to step on a series of large, flat rocks that served as a natural bridge. Alara, in her practical work boots, stepped onto the first stone. The next was a little further, and the surface was slick with a thin layer of green moss. She hesitated, judging the distance. Colton, who was already on the other side, turned and held out his hand. "Here," he said simply. She looked at his hand, strong, calloused, scarred, the hand that had taught her to tie a knot, that had held hers in the hayloft, that had pulled her from the dust. It was the hand of a man she trusted with her life. She placed her hand in his, and his fingers closed around hers, strong and sure. He guided her easily across the slick stone. She stepped onto the bank beside him, but he didn't let go of her hand. She turned to face him, the sound of the running water filling the quiet air. The sun streamed down through the cottonwood leaves, dappling their faces with light. The whole world seemed to hold its breath. She stood on her toes, raised her free hand to cup his jaw, and kissed him. It was not a hesitant, questioning kiss like the one in the hayloft. It was a kiss of certainty. It was open and honest and full of a deep, quiet joy. It was a kiss in the bright, unfiltered sunlight, with no walls to hide behind, no storm to rage outside. It tasted of clean water and the faint, sweet scent of the wet earth. It was a kiss entirely without fear. When she pulled back, he was smiling, a real, unguarded smile that lit up his entire face. He looked, in that moment, like a man who had finally come home. And then, from far away, a sound drifted on the clear air, thin and lonely and full of promise. Woo, woo. It was the whistle of the noon train, making its way across the vast open plains, miles to the south. It was the sound of the world changing, of telegraphs and industry, and a future that was rushing towards them. It was a sound that had once represented escape, a way out. But as Alara stood there, her hand held securely in Colton's, the sound was not a temptation. It was just a distant echo. The world could rush on. Her heart, she knew, had already chosen its place. She was already home. The night was a deep and profound quiet. The festival-goers had long since returned to their homes, the paper lanterns extinguished, leaving the vast star-dusted sky to reclaim its dominion. The world had shrunk back to the familiar boundaries of the Lost Comet Ranch, a sanctuary carved out of the wilderness, now silent, save for the chirping of crickets and the occasional, lonely call of a distant owl. The air was cool and clean, still carrying the memory of the rain, a scent of damp earth and new life. They did not go directly to the house. An unspoken understanding, a magnetic pull, led them instead towards the dark, looming shape of the barn. It was a pilgrimage back to the place where the world had been held at bay, where a new truth had been spoken in the heart of a storm. The new, smaller barn was still under construction, a skeleton of fresh-cut pine that smelled of promise, but the old, larger structure, though damaged, still stood, a testament to their survival. Colton lit the same lantern he had lit on that night of the storm. He hung it from the same hook in the hayloft, and once again, a warm, golden circle of light pushed back the immense, velvety darkness. The air was thick with the sweet, dry scent of hay, a perfume of peace and honest labor. They stood in the quiet, listening to the soft rustle of the horses in the stalls below, the sound of their own steady breathing. This was their place. It had been forged in crisis, and now it was a cathedral of their quiet affection. Alara looked around the loft, at the sturdy beams, at the motes of dust dancing in the lantern light. She felt no fear here. The ghosts of her past had been exorcised by fire and water, by justice and by kindness. She turned to Colton. He was watching her, his face in the soft light stripped of its usual hardness, his eyes full of a quiet, wondering tenderness. She took a step closer, her heart not hammering with fear, but beating with a slow, strong, and certain rhythm. She reached out and placed her hand flat on his chest, over his heart. She could feel its steady, powerful beat beneath her palm, a rhythm that matched her own. Her eyes, when she looked up at him, were bright, not with unshed tears of terror, but with the clear, unwavering light of a woman who knew her own mind. She was not trembling. "Get inside first," she whispered, her own words from that first, desperate day returning, but imbued now with an entirely new meaning. She saw the flicker of memory in his eyes, the deep understanding. My first time is not something that can be taken, or demanded, or won in a card game. Her voice was low, but it did not waver. My first time is when I truly want it. He did not move. He did not speak. His entire body went still, a statue carved in the golden light. He froze, but it was not a freeze of shock or rejection. It was a freeze of reverence, of a man suddenly confronted with a gift so precious, so profoundly trusting, that he was afraid his slightest movement might shatter it. He held his breath, the weight of her declaration settling over him, an honor and a responsibility beyond any he had ever known. Then, slowly, a smile touched the corners of his mouth. It was a smile of such aching tenderness that it made Alara's heart swell. He reached up and covered her hand on his chest with his own, his rough, callous skin a familiar comfort against hers. "Alara," he murmured, his voice a low, rough whisper. He was confirming the boundaries, building the foundation of this moment brick by verbal brick. "Are you sure this is what you want?" She did not break eye contact. She gave a single, slow, deliberate nod. Yes. He searched her eyes, his gaze so intense it felt like he was looking directly into her soul. "We can just stay here. We can talk. We can do nothing, and it will all be just as good." "I know," she said, her voice soft. "That's why this is different." He nodded, accepting her certainty. He let out a slow breath, the last of his own restraint giving way not to passion, but to a profound, shared intention. His hand moved from hers, sliding up to gently cup her jaw, his thumb stroking her cheek. The touch was a question. "Is this okay?" he whispered. She leaned into his hand, a silent, unequivocal yes. She was in control. She was leading the pace of their intimacy, not with commands, but with her own responses, her own breathing, the way her body answered his. Every single point of contact was a conversation, a quiet, mutual agreement. The lantern light seemed to shrink their entire universe down to the small, sacred space between them. Outside, the crickets sang their ancient song to the stars. Inside, there was only the sound of their breathing and the steady, synchronized beat of their two hearts. He leaned down, and the kiss that followed was deeper than the one they had shared in the storm, but it was forged from the same elements: gentleness, patience, and a profound respect. It was a kiss that spoke of homecoming, of a long and arduous journey finally reaching its destination. His other hand found hers, and their fingers interlaced, a familiar solid grip that had once been about partnership in labor and was now about partnership in love. It was a perfect, seamless transition. They were not two halves becoming whole. They were two whole people, forged in fire and hardship, choosing to stand together. They were not tearing at clothes. They were not fumbling in a desperate physical rush. They were slowly, carefully, removing the last invisible layers of their armor, the solitude he had worn like a second skin, the fear she had carried in the marrow of her bones. In the warm, golden light, they were letting go of the ghosts, allowing themselves to be seen, truly and completely, for the very first time. The kiss ended, but they did not part. They stayed close, their foreheads resting against each other, their breath mingling in the small space between them. Elara opened her eyes. His were already open, watching her, filled with a love so deep and so patient it took her breath away. "I choose," she whispered, the words a simple, sacred vow. "I choose this. I choose you." A single, perfect tear welled in the corner of his eye and traced a slow path down his weathered cheek. "Me too," he answered, his voice thick with an emotion he had long thought buried. "I choose you, Elara." Two simple, declarative statements, a commitment made not before a preacher or a judge, but here, in the heart of their sanctuary, witnessed only by the quiet, listening night. The imagined camera of the moment holds there. It does not move. It captures the profound intimacy of the gesture, his forehead pressed to hers, her hand still on his chest, his on her jaw. Their eyes are locked. Their breath is one single, shared rhythm. The world outside, with all its dangers and its demands, ceases to exist. There is only this perfect, unadorned, and hard-won peace. The screen holds on their faces, on the absolute certainty in their eyes, and then, ever so slowly, begins to fade. And from outside, carried on a soft night breeze that whispers through the eaves of the barn, comes one last, final sound, the faint, clear, and gentle chime of the little brass bell on the front door of the house, swaying in the darkness. It is not a warning. It is not an intrusion. It is a lullaby. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We'd love to know where you're listening from, so please feel free to share your city or country in the comments below to connect with fellow fans. If you enjoyed this journey, please consider subscribing to our channel, Wild West Stories, 1850. Give this video a like, and if you'd like to help this story reach more listeners, please consider hitting that hype button. Your support means the world to us.